Hi, welcome to this presentation entitled Executive Functioning and Deaf and Hard of Hearing Students, Definitions, Interventions, and Modifications. So, who am I, and why am I qualified to give this presentation on this subject? My name is Angie Lawson, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm hearing, and I have deaf parents. I got my PhD from Gallaudet University in clinical psychology, and right now I have contracts with different agencies, and one of my contracts is with Colorado School for the Deaf and the Blind, CSDB, and I work with deaf and hard of hearing students. So the purpose of today's presentation, if I do my job right, I want you to become familiar with executive functioning, and I'll be using the sign EF. And I want to give you some ideas for modifications and interventions for either students with EF difficulties or just regular classroom management. I want you to think about that as well. We will discuss modifications for students with dysfluency and other disabilities. Dysfluency means a person that doesn't have fluency in any language. And maybe you can understand most of what's being said, but maybe not all of it. It seems odd. It has different characteristics for the language, or maybe you can't understand the student at all. Today we'll be talking about executive functioning. And there's not one definition for that. A lot of different professionals have different ideas about what that definition should be. So I picked one that I thought matched the best. And EF means the cognitive processes that enable individuals to engage in and sustain goal-directed and problem-solving behaviors. And that's also for future actions.
Not only do they need to do this, but they need to sustain it. This includes things such as planning, organizing, strategizing, remembering details, managing time, and self-analysis and feedback about what I'm doing right and wrong. Executive function requires that working memory, inhibitory control, mental flexibility, and self-regulation work together. I put a question mark by self-regulation because it's similar and really included in the first three. I'll discuss that more later. Some people like to use a metaphor of an air traffic controller of the brain. Next, I'm going to show a video from Harvard University from the Center on the Developing Child that talks about this comparison, this metaphor, and discusses executive functioning, focusing more on young children.
Science tells us that brains, minds, are built, not born. And at the center of this dynamic architecture are a set of skills called executive function and self-regulation.
Children's self-regulation and executive function are key ingredients in their lifetime performance. It's not just about learning language or learning numbers or learning colors. We have to be able to work effectively with others, with distractions, with multiple demands. These actually are skills that contribute to the productivity of the American workforce.
Look at your shapes. What should you have done next?
Educators, I think, are looking for just this sort of thing. And when we describe what we mean by executive function, they say, yes, that's it. That's exactly, the problem. These kids, they can tell me these rules, but they can't actually use them.
What's this?
A toolbox.
A toolbox.
What is executive function?
Safety goggles.
Safety goggles.
Probably the best way to think about it is sort of like an air traffic control system in the brain. Just like an air traffic control system has to manage lots of airplanes going on lots of runways and really exquisite timing and so on, a child has to manage a lot of information and avoid distractions. We really think of it as involving working memory and inhibitory control and mental flexibility. Take a situation where a child is having to take turns. So first of all, the child has to have inhibitory control. The child has to be able to stop whatever he or she is doing and let the other child take a turn.
Cute.
But when it's your turn again, you also have to remember what it is you're supposed to be doing. So that pulls on working memory. If the children who are taking the turns after you do something unpredictable, you have to be able to adjust what you're going to do next. And that requires mental flexibility. Children who are struggling with these capacities often look like children who just aren't paying attention, or children who are deliberately not controlling themselves.
If you don't have self-regulation, you act out and the teacher puts you in timeout, and so then you miss part of the learning that's going on, and then you are more upset because you're behind, and so you act out, and so you get this downward spiral.
How does executive function develop?
7. And +4.
In little children, and even in the infant and toddler years, you begin to see the roots of executive functioning skills. What's going on in our brains is unbelievably intricate and complicated.
The prefrontal cortex, or the front third of the brain, is important for executive function. But it's more than just prefrontal cortex. This region doesn't act alone. It's involved in controlling your behavior through its interactions with all other parts of the brain. The brain goes from a situation where you've got nearest neurons communicating very strongly with each other and ignoring the rest of the brain, to these widespread networks that are connecting these different areas. Executive function changes over the life course. It improves radically over the first few years.
I got a match drum.
It continues to improve throughout adolescence. It's not until early adulthood that you have the adult-type networks that are very strongly activated that connect different brain regions together.
Let's take notes.
Also, we believe that executive functions can be trained.
It's just like going to the gym. So the more you practice in these areas, the stronger the capacity is likely to become, because you're helping to strengthen those neural connections.
You're at 24.
Slowly but surely, you're going to be able to step back, and that child's going to go into the world with these skills where they can get along with other people, change rules, and they can be flexible, and they can accomplish new things, and they're unafraid.
I got bit by my dog in my arm. Oh dear.
If we don't learn these skills during the childhood and adolescent years when they're coming online, we are really ill-equipped as an adult to hold a job, to maintain a marriage, to raise children, to get along with each other, to basically be part of a civil society.
You're okay.
So EF development over time. If a child is born with the ability to develop EF skills, that's called nature, but they need to experience exposure to develop those skills. That's more the nurture part of things. Also, if you think as far as biopsychosocial, the person has the ability internally, they're born with that, but they need psychological characteristics and experience to develop those skills. You saw in the video they were talking about early experiences for EF. Also, Harvard University had a paper related to that video talking more in depth about EF development for young children. One of the things the paper talked about was adult and children interactions. That's called scaffolding. So the adult gives the child some structure in order to develop those EF skills. Over time, as the child, they may not need the structure anymore, so the parent has to kind of back away and let the child develop those EF skills on their own. The adult has to be sensitive to the child's needs. Some studies found that SES, socioeconomic status, they found that to be related to EF skills as well. Or families who might not have very much money or a lot of time for that interaction, that could impact their EF skills. So with money, sometimes we feel like, they're in survival mode and they don't have enough time to experience, the budgeting, or they have to save money for certain things. And sometimes if you don't have money to spend, then it would depend on your situation. If the child doesn't get those experience of seeing their parents, budgeting, working with money, or maybe they don't have the time to socialize with the child, or maybe they don't have those skills, and that's why they found the SES was related to those skills. And that's a hypothesis. And through play, children can practice and develop those EF skills, like turn taking, working with other kids. You might find out that they're not supposed to do something with a certain student, like they'll test out the skills, and they can learn from that experience. Also, EF is a really good foundational learning. If you don't have work with memory or self-control, and that would be hard to learn in the classroom. So we need to have those skills for reading, writing, math, discussion in class. Even with play, you have to know some things, like how to join a group, how to take turns, be appropriate with your peers. One myth is that they'll say, kids will grow out of that behavior. They can't pay attention right now, they don't take turns, but don't worry about it, later they'll be fine. And actually, you can see by age 1 that they have some of those skills developing. Kids who have really low skills later will also have problems with the same thing. Not all, but most. Now I want to go through and define each part of EF. So we'll start with working memory. So what does that mean? It means when you hold information in your head, but you can also manipulate that information. Think about like storage in your head, but you have to rearrange things. So the two parts of working memory are visuospatial and phonological. So you can use, if you're using hearing, like repeating information over and over again and holding on to that in your brain until you need it to solve a problem. Same thing with the visual spatial. You might have some picture in your head and then you save that until you need to, give that information to someone. So we use working memory a lot of the time, every day of our lives, at school and at work as well. When you have to memorize phone numbers or your, web address, or, you have to think about, that information before you can use it. Also, if someone tells you directions to the library from school, and you have to remember it's right at the second intersection, and then turn right, and then go left when you see the McDonald's. And so when you're driving, you have to remember, okay, it's the second intersection, and I turn right, and then I see McDonald's, I turn left. But once you use it, it's gone. You don't hold on to that information. Also at school for writing and spelling, if you think of, how to spell a word, you have to hold on to that. Like working. So I have to remember how to spell that until I can use that word. And then I'll know it in the future. Math, if you subtract in your head like 20 minus 8 equals 12, you have to manipulate that information and have your brain work to find the answer. And if you forget the first number, then you can't figure out the rest of the problem. So you have to hold that information in order and work with it at the same time. Inhibitory control. Remember in the video you saw the little boy and he really wanted the toy. So he went to grab it, but remember, he knows that he's not supposed to take the toy. And so he has to wait till his turn. So see how so that he grabbed for it, but then he didn't touch it. So that was good inhibitory control. And we all have that internally, that impulse that we want to do something, but we have to control ourselves, right? So at work and school, you have those filters in your head, and you don't just say whatever comes to mind. Another definition I put on the PowerPoint is the ability to resist a strong inclination to do one thing instead of do what's most appropriate or needed. So I put a picture of a little girl looking at a marshmallow. And that's from a test. So researchers thought it would be fun to look at how kids can control themselves. So they put one plate with one marshmallow, and they told the kids, I'm going to leave, and if you need to eat the marshmallow, ring the bell. And I'll come back, and then you can eat it. If you can wait until I come back, then you can have 2 marshmallows. So they noticed that the kids who ate the marshmallow right away had problems with EF skills. And also, following some of that participation throughout life, they would have problems with that in the future. Some kids were able to wait 15 minutes for 2 marshmallows. They found that those kids were really successful in life, that was the outcome later. Even looking at SAT scores, there was one group that they didn't have any of that inhibitory control, and then the other group that waited a long time to eat the marshmallows, that group scored an average of 120 points higher than the group that didn't have the inhibitory control on the SAT. So researchers were curious how that group of kids avoided eating the marshmallow. They found out that they distracted themselves by singing or playing around the room, maybe hiding, and not sitting there staring at the marshmallow, drooling over it. The kids in the group that had problems with inhibitory control, they just gave up. They were sitting there staring at it, gave up and ate it. So in thinking about socialization as adults, if your friend or coworker came in and just got a haircut and it looks awful, and they said, "Do you like my haircut?" And internally you might think no, but you have to inhibit that response. You have to say, "Oh, it looks nice." That's just social awareness. And so you would have to have that skill in order to be to socialize appropriately. Also, when you're driving, if you're at a stoplight and there's a car behind you, and then the light turns green, and then the person doesn't go, then, do you honk right away, or do you let them take the time to go? So we use those EF skills in everyday life. The third part is talking about mental flexibility. That means the person has the ability to be working on something and then change to a different task right away and go on working, and not worry about what happened with the previous task. They're able to switch easily. Also, they know which rules apply to which position or situation. So, for example, kids know that they're outside at recess playing, and that you can yell and you can use your body to move around, and it doesn't matter because that's what it's for, outside play. But inside during math, can you yell or move around or things like that? You can't. Sorry, that's not allowed. So kids who have that mental flexibility know that the outdoors activities, you can do those things, but indoors it has a different set of rules. So I'll use driving again as an example. When I moved to Colorado from Washington, D.C. area, they have different rules for driving there. If a person at a red light, once it turns green and they don't go right away, you have to honk. You say, "Hurry up, let's go." But here in Colorado, that is not a nice, polite thing to do. You have to wait 3 or 4 seconds. If they don't move, then just give them a little honk and then move on. I realized moving here that this is not, they don't have the same rules, and I had to learn a different set of rules because it's a different location. Also, you might tell your coworker something like, "Oh, I'm so bored at this meeting. I don't want to go to another meeting. I'm really sick of my boss, blah, blah, blah." And if you go to a board meeting, can you say the same thing? Say, "I'm so bored of this meeting. My boss is annoying me." You can't do that. You know the difference between, the different set of groups of people that you can talk to. Obviously your friends will keep things private and it won't impact your job, but if I say that at a board meeting, it might impact my job. Also, mental flexibility, you can look at things and see if you've made a mistake. So if I'm doing a math problem, it's 24 minus 8, and I put down 15, and then I realize I have to go back and look at it again and that it's 16, you're able to notice that it's not right and go back and fix it. Also, you can include new information and changes in that strategy. So like if you're making cookies, and the recipe says, I need a 1/4 cup of butter, but you only have 1/8 of a cup of butter. So what do? You need to find another substitute or change your strategy. So maybe you use applesauce, or maybe you make half a batch. You have to figure out that new information. If I don't have butter, then how do I change my plan so that I can use what I have? So remember at the beginning of the presentation, I put self-regulation and then I had a question mark by it. And now I'll talk about self-regulation and why I put that question mark. Self-regulation often is seen with EF. Those two words are seen together many times. Some researchers say that self-regulation is really the same as EF. Really, EF is the foundation for self-regulation. And you can use those terms. They both kind of mean the same thing for most people. A famous researcher named Barkley gave a good example of how you can use either word, EF or self-regulation. If you were on a diet and you went into a coffee shop and they had really good pastries in like a case, like with a window, and you saw it and you really wanted some and you thought that it looked really good. But you know that you're on a diet. Can you eat the pastry on a diet? So maybe you'll try to think of something else, like something to try and distract yourself, what you're going to do later so you're not thinking about the pastry. Or maybe you'll just walk away and not sit there staring at the pastry. Remember like the marshmallow experiment? The students that did well didn't sit there staring at it, they did something else to distract themselves. So you might visualize yourself later 10 pounds lighter, and you have to focus on that goal to try and convince yourself not to buy the pastry. So a lot of that in that example has to do with self-regulation. To not do something that you want to do. If you talk about that inhibitory control. Also working memory, remember you have to use the skills in EF if you want to self-regulate. So I think it's important to, maybe you'll see the information and you need to have So why is that information important? It's good to know that if you see an intervention for self-regulation, you can use that for EF skills. It's really the same thing. Now we're going to talk about diagnoses related with EF difficulties. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And is EF the same as ADHD? If a student has problems with EF, does that mean that they have ADHD? Not always. The definition for ADHD for combined type means they have significant problems with attention. Also problems with continuing to an end goal. They have a hard time focusing and not drifting off to other tasks. They don't have that control for, they'll just say anything that they want. Sometimes a person with ADHD, they act inappropriately or express themselves inappropriately. And people with ADHD tend to have problems with EF. So ADHD, that underlying problem is the EF difficulties. But if a student has EF problems, that doesn't mean that they meet the criteria for ADHD. You have to look at the criteria for ADHD and see if a student would meet that. You can get that information from a formal assessment. One thing that's important to know about ADHD is that kids they know what they're supposed to do, but have a hard time doing it. So they can't resist that distraction. So they know I'm supposed to be working and doing this specific task, but they have a hard time with that. Also, kids with autism have a hard time with EF as well. It's almost the same as ADHD, some working memory problems, some mental flexibility problems. So you'll see kids with autism that might have a hard time transitioning. If you're working on something specific, then stop that task and move on to something else. They have a really hard time with that. And that's mental flexibility, that part of EF. So now I want to talk about EF and deaf individuals. The research with the deaf group is always a small number. And if you see the research study and you read who the participants are, you can see if that would apply to your group of students. Sometimes they're college students or they have no other disabilities. And so the results, of those 20 people will just be for that group. And it may not apply to all groups. So you have to check that research for yourself. Some researchers have found that EF is related to language ability for deaf and hearing. So remember we talked about working memory and the phonological part. So if a person hears something over and over again and holds on to that memory as needed until they need it, better for, for a sequential information, like steps, what to do. Like first, I go into the classroom, I take off my coat and I hang it up. Then I put my backpack on the hook and then I sit down. So those are different steps to process information. So that is based on auditory. Also self-talk, and that relates to language ability as well. So if you say something and then you have to go back and fix it, so you can talk to yourself in your head. If you don't have that language skill, then maybe you don't have the ability to self-talk. Many kids will hear parents or adults talking, and that relates to EF as well. They do something they might need to change, that would be mental flexibility. Or if they plan to do something and something else comes up, then you have to change your plan. Then maybe parents will talk out loud and say, oh well, that happened, now we have to move on with something else. So when they're hearing that information, they internalize that information. It becomes part of their own talk. If they don't have that exposure to language, then maybe they won't be able to develop that EF skill. And that doesn't apply to deaf children with deaf parents, because they do have language from birth. They have access to, they see their parents signing out loud. So that would also develop into an EF skill. So that would help them with language. We know that deaf children that are born to hearing parents, that's about 90 to 95%. And only 5 to 10% have that language acquisition from birth. So the researchers looked at a group of deaf students with deaf parents and found out that they had appropriate EF skills for children their age. They looked at their behavior, they did analysis and filled out forms. The parents and teachers were involved, and if they didn't have those language skills, the EF was impacted. Some studies with deaf individuals with EF showed if they were bilingual and they had mental flexibility, they had
good relationships.
Because they can use both languages and go between the two languages. Also, studies found that when they use one language and the other language is still there, but you have to resist not using that other language. So that mental flexibility becomes very strong. They found that if toddlers were able to have more mental flexibility if they were bilingual compared to toddlers that had one language. Also with older people, if they were bilingual since they were young compared to an older person that just had one language, the person that was bilingual would do better on mental flexibility assignments compared to the person who didn't. Also, some research shows that visual attention is improved for deaf individuals. For people who use sign language, studies related to EF, the results vary. Some deaf teenagers who use sign language, and then they had deaf teenagers who were more oral in a different group, and they did better than the group of the signers. Another study found that the signers were better, had better EF skills, especially social cues, knowing what to say appropriately, and I don't think there's enough evidence to make a conclusion about that. So now you know some information from research, and you would expect high rates of EF problems with deaf individuals, so I guess, and because of the language delay with deaf children, and that relating to EF, we do expect deaf children to have some delay with EF as well. Also, some studies found that hearing adults with deaf children don't have that scaffolding. Remember, we talked about that before. They're more telling the child what to do and not, turn taking and interacting with the child. Also, if a child is still learning language, goes to school and gets those visual, ASL or English, if they're behind and they have to work really hard to try and pick up that language, the EF skills might be reduced as well. If you're doing your working memory, your mental flexibility, all that stuff, you can't focus on learning language. Also for ADHD, they found more diagnosis of that disease with deaf children. Up to 35% of deaf and hard of hearing students who have deafness that's not genetic are diagnosed with ADHD. That might be because maybe they're deaf from an illness or a brain injury, and so maybe they have the problems with attention. Autism a researcher, Zemansky, found that deaf children are 1 out of 59 will have autism. And that is different than hearing children. Now, for hearing children, it's about 1 in 88 students that has autism. So we see more deaf and hard of hearing children that are diagnosed with autism. When we talk about ADHD and autism, there's more EF difficulties with that. And we expect more deaf children to have those problems than the hearing group. So what do you see in your classroom with your students? If you think about your students, What type of EF problems or strengths do you see with your students? Teachers say many times that the EF problem children are hard to deal with. Harvard University, the paper that I talked about earlier, the teacher said that the EF difficulties make them feel burned out and frustrated. If you have 20 kids in a classroom and 2 have EF problems, that can mess up the whole class. So the classroom management can become overwhelming. So how do you know if your student has a problem with EF? If the student has a hard time being organized, like organizing their thoughts or taking notes, or just not having the materials they need, time management problems, if you give them step-by-step instructions and they only follow the first step and not the second and third, so that might show that they have some EF difficulties. Also, if you see a student who has a hard time socializing with other students, saying things that aren't nice or not appropriate, not taking turns, the classmates get upset with that student, then they might have a problem with EF. So I think it's important to know when you need to refer. If you suspect it's ADHD or other situation, and they're not able to function in the classroom, then it might be time to refer that student for an official psychology evaluation. So what are the consequences of EF difficulties? I have a list, but it doesn't include everything. EF difficulties can lead to acting out, not included in groups of students because the students don't like that person's behavior because they don't take turns, being behind academically, maybe they don't finish their homework or they're not paying attention in class, and they're not learning the same as their peers. Maybe their grades are lower than their classmates. A lot of the students will give up and they'll say that they're not good at school. Sometimes students feel very negatively about themselves or about school. They don't want to go to school. And because they get in trouble most of the time, they're not paying attention or they're doing something that's inappropriate and they get yelled at and they feel that's negative. Also, remember the video, they were talking about how you need those EF skills to be a productive member of society. So you need to function in your job or have relationships. The good news is that you can practice those skills. You can create interventions for your students to help them develop those EF skills. Before we delve into the interventions, I want you to think about the things that we're talking about. So for the classroom or the individual, how you could do an assessment for what the student needs, which age group your class is, what language ability If you have a variety of different level students, then how would you modify that intervention for a lower or higher student? Could you try to have an intervention with the curriculum that you're using, or do you need to have a separate one? Does your school have resources, or can you use applied modifications? And how do you know if your intervention is successful? Will you do the research and, evaluations, or who will do that? Also, you need some responsibility as well, accountability. So the teacher needs to be accountable for that intervention for the student. Some of you were wondering about accommodations. So we're focused on the positive, and remember that I said sometimes kids feel negative when they go to school. Every day they get in trouble and get yelled at. That they feel that's negative. So if we focus on the positive, like if they do something correctly, even if it's a small thing, then give that positive reinforcement. Or consider like rewards for that student, reward reinforcements. If it's stickers or earning a party for the whole class, something that you can try to make them feel like they're earning something. You can make it fun and personal as well. If you be real creative, you can come up with an intervention. Like preschool and kindergarten, kids sing like the cleanup song. Everyone has to clean up. So that's how they learn to focus on the cleaning. And they remember, oh, right, I'm supposed to be cleaning because I'm singing, and I'm supposed to be cleaning. So if we are creative, and especially for deaf and hard of hearing students have to watch, they can't watch and clean at the same time. So maybe start the song with a drum, and then when they feel that beat, they can still keep, if you keep beating the drum, they can clean up while they feel that vibration. That would be for young kids. Older kids, you have to think of something creative to express, that so they remember it. If you make it more personal, like if you have rules in the classroom, it can be related to EF skills as well. You can have a picture of like rule number 1. You have a picture of a student next to rule number 1, and it's their responsibility to follow up with that rule. And it helps with responsibility and working with other students. Kids can't grow if they're not challenged. So we want to make sure to see that level and challenge help them grow in their EF skills. I would recommend to keep new, fresh ideas, not the same thing all the time. Especially kids with ADHD. If they have the same thing happen all the time, they get very bored quickly. And so the intervention won't be successful. You have to change things. I have some accommodations for working with memory. Remember, working memory is more like storage. So it's like a storage location. So if you have a visual aid, you can put that down with the information. So the students don't have to hold so much information. They can be working and see what it is and then look back down at their paper. So the visual aids are important. Maybe you want students to be more responsible. So you can give them little whiteboards and they have to write down definitions, or they will have to, if you tell them information and they have to write it down, and then, because that will force them to hold on to the information, and that might lead to failure. So we need to provide them with the accommodations to help. You might have to repeat yourself that information just to help them remember it. Also, teaching self-advocacy skills. If a student misses something and they don't remember something, they need to know to ask the teacher. I need help, or I forgot, can you help me? Something like that. So if we're doing something in class and it's something that's very routine, that will help them. If you're doing something every day that's routine and it's not working memory anymore because they already know that, it's already in their mind. So that becomes part of their long-term memory. They don't have to keep holding on to that information if it's a routine. If you have a big project, you can try to break it up into smaller parts. Say, first we're going to do research on that subject. And then secondly, we will read. And then third, we will summarize the article. And then fourth, you can type your paper. And then at the end, we'll just modify and edit. Sometimes the students will feel very overwhelmed if you give them a big project. So if you help them focus on one portion, that will be helpful. Also, technology is a great resource. If your students have iPhones and they're allowed to use them, or computers, that really helps. If the students have, an alarm at 3:15, that means they have to pack up their backpacks, and that all of a sudden they get that alert, then they know that they need to put their books away and gather up their homework and things like that. So then they don't have to, hold on to that information of, at 3:15 I have to pack up my backpack. So when the kids, sometimes the kids won't have the correct books or things like that because they're in such a rush at the end of the day. Now, other accommodations for mental flexibility, switching topics or transitioning. Maybe you'll have to plan or structure that transition time to help them realize that, okay, we need to stop this activity and move on to something else. It helps if you do that every day, so the students are aware when the teacher says, okay, it's time to do whatever, and then they can move on to the next thing, the next activity. Also, if the teacher can help the students by saying, this is important information, that helps them kind of pay attention and not, maybe they're off in kind of a daydream or something like that, or they're in the middle of an activity, and then if you say something that they need to pay attention to, you have to make sure you get their attention. For time management, it helps if before you start an activity, you put down on paper what the steps are. like how many steps there might be. So maybe number one would be research for an article. So maybe put down 30 or 40 minutes for their project, so that the student knows what's the appropriate time length for that. Or they can check off things as they go. When they finish something, that really helps them if you check it off as you go. If you have an older student, you can encourage them to make a timeline. Or if they know that the due date is in February and they want to start, with the last assignment, and then say that'll take about a week, and then move toward the present, so that they know when they need to start and how much time it will take for each assignment or activity. Visual time is really great. You can have it high tech, buy an online timeline or other resource that you can use to show. There's like a color for whatever time is left. If there's 5 minutes left, then it'll have an alarm when it's over. Or low tech, you can always use, those sand counters, the hourglass, so that they know when the sand is, completely gone, then that's the end of the time. In your classroom, if you use a visual calendar, you can put on your wall what the homework is, when the homework is due, have everything written out on the board so the students can remember the dates that everything is due. Also with technology, that, it helps to remind students. Suppose if I need to do something every day at noon, it helps to manage your time if you have that alert. Even if it's a computer or a cell phone or an alarm or whatever, that reminds you to do something. For every assignment or homework or whatever, you should always put a due date at the top so that the student can remember when to turn it in. So also, accommodation can also help manage space and materials. There's an old saying that there's a place for everything and everything in its place. And the reason for that is that it's easy to remember where to leave something. If you put it in the exact same spot every time, you'll know where it is. And it will help with organization. Like if you always have your pens in the desk in that specific spot, then they won't have to go looking around for a pencil that will waste time. Many times kids who have EF problems, they like distractions. So if they can't find a pen, it could become 10 minutes of looking for something, and then they're behind on their work because the work is hard. Maybe you can say, 2 minutes before the end of class that they need to clean up and organize everything. Also, you want to be a good role model. If your classroom is clean and organized, has a place for everything, and not too many visual distractions, that would be helpful. Some kids really benefit from having a planner. Just one book, not many things, just one book that has everything in it. So when the homework is due, big projects, class pictures, or anything like that. Also, some like color coding. So like green would mean English and purple would be math. So every day they can put everything in the correct folder. Also, manage the workload. I talked before about breaking up big projects. And remember, not all kids can start with research. Some really need to kind of work up to that. Maybe they need to go to the computer or use pen and paper, because you have to have really detailed steps. You have to see their current level and decide what's the best accommodation. Also, you can set up weekly meetings. So if one student has a really hard time managing, homework or handing in assignments, things like that, then you can set up weekly meetings where you go, to see if you're improving or how they're doing. Maybe they need more assistance. Another accommodation for homework. So if I forget my homework, I know who to ask because I've already assigned someone that position, that job. So I would have like a homework buddy. So it's easy to know who to ask for help. Also, parents really need to be involved. Maybe at home they're doing something that works, and so we could try that at school as well. So many times parents complain that the student isn't doing their chores and they have to tell them things many times, or if they do the first step and they don't remember the second and third steps. And so if we're having the same problems at school, we try to have the same interventions at home and school. So another modification you can use is to be the model. You can model for your students, being organized or planning things for activities, and show them what good EF skills look like. Also, you can think aloud. If you have some mental flexibility of things that can happen and you realize that you've made a mistake, then you can tell the students out loud what is going on. Say, oh, I made a mistake, I just realized it, let me go back and fix that. Or you can say, I'm trying to remember, hold on just a second. Or often I'll say, oh no, I don't want to do that, never mind. So it's good for them to see you using your EF skills. Also, make sure you're asking the students, leading them to develop their EF skills, not just telling them things to do. Help them develop and stretch those muscles to develop those skills. Also, tell the students how you're feeling. It's good for them to know, or try to read people's emotions. So if you give them information about how you're feeling, that will help them develop that EF skill. We're all human and we all make mistakes. And so show the students that it's okay to make mistakes and how to go back and fix those mistakes, the process of that. I know also some programs teach the teachers how to model and coach EF behavior. So there's a lot of research based facts about that. Also, be consistent. Don't change things every day. Try to do the same structure, even though if you want to, try some new topics and things like that, that's fine. But the schedule itself should stay the same because that will help the students go through their day. I think also extracurricular activities are really helpful. If kids have, fun doing something, but they have to focus on it and learn how to do something or remember specific things to do that are new, it's not distracting, but it can be a focus for them. You can use sports, basketball, tennis, anything like that. Also karate or martial arts, yoga. You can also use dancing or music. Here at CSDB, we use one activity with students that's really popular. It's called Minesweeper, and we use that on the floor. For example, you can put squares on the floor, and each student has to try to figure out the pattern. So the teacher has the pattern written down, and the students have to step on different things. If they're wrong, then they have to go back and try to remember what the pattern is. So, and then they have to make it to the end. The students can help each other. They have to remember, hold on to that information about which way they're supposed to go through this pattern, and that's a really good activity for developing EF skills. For younger students, you can label feelings. Like you can say your own feelings or their feelings. You can say, can you guess how this other student is feeling, and help them to think about those things. They can see the student and try and figure that out. That helps with sequential activities. You can show pictures of a sequence and ask them what happens next. See if they can figure out from the pictures. One cool thing that I read about is an experience book. The kids will take pictures, maybe just at the zoo or something for a specific day. They'll bring those to school, and then they'll make an experience book. The students have to tell the story of what happened, sequentially what happened in the past, what they felt like. They have to label those things, and then they can make it personal. You can ask the students to practice their EF skills at play. So before they go into their classes, they have like center time. Maybe they want to go to the theater section. You can ask them before they go there what they plan to do, what's their goal. And it helps them think ahead. What am I going to do and how will I be successful? You can play guessing games. Like, I'm thinking of something round. It's white, and then kind of help them try to figure out what it is that you're thinking about. Also, make sure you ask them questions that aren't yes and no questions. Make them think about it, and that will help encourage them as well. Just lead them to develop those EF skills. For older students, use peer or parent tutoring. That's helpful because if they're one-on-one, they get that feedback right away. They have to participate. They can't just sit back and watch. They have to develop those skills with the one-on-one attention. You could develop so if a student is on task for 5 minutes, we can go ahead and they can check off on that chart that they did pay attention for 5 minutes or whatever. And then at the end, they can get a reward. And that helps with accountability and motivation. You can play 20 questions or other guessing games for more of a high level if it's for older students. I'm thinking of something in this room, and then they have to ask me, is it red? And I say no, and they have to figure out what I'm thinking of. You can use strategy games like chess, checkers, Battleship. Those are good games to try and figure out where where the ship is. I really like the next one called Personal Best. So they have to set their own goals. If the student is struggling with reading, for example, not compared to other students, that you would say, my reading might be 3 pages every day after school, and that's it. So for myself, I want to try to get to 10 pages every day. And so then they can document that. So first, I need to get a book. Second, I need to discuss with my mom to come up with a plan so that I know that after dinner I need that time. Find a place that's quiet and comfortable and a place to sit and read that they won't have distractions. That can help a student be prepared and document that information, and that's accountability as well. It's almost like sports or competition. Like they're going to win a record. They're trying to beat that record, and so that's motivation. Also, if there's some activities where they have choices, try to match their interests. So don't just give all of the students the same topic. Let them choose one that they'll be more interested in. That's motivating for them to be able to, and they will work harder. So some programs have specific tools in mind. I'm not saying that this is better or anything. This is just an example. The tools of the mind. The program is for young students, preschoolers and kindergartners. There's a lot of research that shows it's effective for the younger children, for paying attention, helping with impulsive behavior, helping with academic skills. But there's a cost associated with that. I don't know how much. You'd have to look at your school and your program and see what the budget is, but it worked for us. The next one I want to talk about accommodations. If you have students with dysfluency, how would you make that fit with those students? You really have to assess each student individually. You can't just do the same intervention the same way for everyone. It won't work. So each student has their own needs and you have to accommodate for that. Some can be the same, like the organization and the classroom rules and things like that, everything being visual. But for language, it really has to be concrete. So you don't want to use the same signs. You want to continue, be consistent and not change. You can use different ways of communicating. If the student uses sign and speaking and gesturing, you can use all of those to try and help the student understand. And more repetition, it'll take longer. The priority is just to pick one thing. So, obviously if you want the child to be safe, and so you want to figure out what's most important to develop with their skills. Also, you have to look at what their strengths are. Maybe they're really good at math, and you can use some of those EF activities with math, since they're already good at that subject. That will add a little bit of a challenge for them. Maybe they have really good social skills, and you can do an EF activity with socialization. You need to give more structure. Like before I said, the open-ended questions, not yes and no questions. So you don't want to have it so open-ended that it's not working. You may have to teach, one skill in the classroom and then apply it in different situations. Some students with disabilities, or maybe they don't realize that in the classroom we have to do these things, that they have to do these same activities in other locations. So you have to tell them, teach them, and practice in different areas. You may have to model more, demonstrate more as well. Try to give them immediate feedback and not wait until an hour later, because then they won't be able to remember what happened. You have to right away say, remember, try not to, hit other students, or we need to do, touch nicely instead. So it has to be in that moment. You might need to hide or put a sheet over some items that are distracting. Some students become obsessed with focusing on one object, and it's hard for the student to do other things. So it makes it easy for the student if, you put things away and hide them. And try to use more visual aids. Don't put too much language that's not concrete. Instead of words, for the areas of the classroom, maybe put pictures. Help them know that this area is for playing, and put cars that, help them organize their thoughts or whatever. And then use your current resources for developing EF skills. If you already have swings in your classroom, or you can use those resources, but try different ways or adding activities to develop EF skills. For motivation, you might need to find something that will help them be motivated. Sometimes students with disabilities don't want to try something new because they're afraid or they're not interested. So maybe you'll have to encourage them with a reward. I hope you learned a lot from today's presentation. Thank you for watching the presentation. If you want to see the PowerPoint slides, go to the wiki site and you will see that information there. And now I'll show the references. Thank you.